They thought you were just another black kid they could push around, someone to mock, ridicule, and humiliate. They laughed at your skin color, treated you like an outsider, believing you were too weak to fight back. But what they didn't know was that they had disturbed the wrong person. Marcus Stone wasn't just an ordinary student. He was the son of Victor Stone, a name whispered throughout the city with fear, a man whose enemies didn't just lose, they disappeared without a trace. And now, the bullies were about to learn a lesson they would never forget. Oak Ridge Academy bustled with its usual morning chaos, laughter echoing down hallways, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floors. But today, something felt different. A new student had arrived. Marcus Stone walked through the main entrance with quiet confidence, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes calmly observing his surroundings. He wasn't dressed to stand out, no designer clothes or flashy accessories. He made no effort to attract attention, but anyone truly paying attention would notice something distinctly different about him. Marcus didn't simply walk. He glided, each step deliberate and purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he stood and who was watching. He didn't anxiously scan his surroundings like other new students. He displayed no awkwardness or disorientation. Instead, he carried an unusual serenity, a sense of absolute control. The grand foyer of Oak Ridge Academy, with its vaulted ceilings and polished wood panels that spoke of old money and privilege, didn't intimidate him. The portraits of distinguished alumni gazing down from the walls, the trophy cases gleaming with decades of achievements, none of it seemed to affect Marcus's measured pace or steady gaze. A few students glanced his way before turning back to their conversations. Others whispered among themselves, curious about this tall, unfamiliar black boy. But no one knew who he truly was. His father, Victor Stone, was not an ordinary man. He was a legend, a name mentioned in shadows, in conversations cut short by fear, a man whose mere presence in a room silenced even the most hardened individuals. But at Oak Ridge, nobody knew that. At least not yet. As Marcus navigated through the crowded main hall, he felt the stares slide over him, the evaluating glances, the whispers that seemed harmless but carried loaded meanings. He didn't need to turn around to know what they were saying. He was all too familiar with this. Comments disguised as jokes, but saturated with prejudice. He looks like he walked straight out of one of those crime shows. I wonder if the school has some kind of diversity quota. Be careful with these guys. They snap, and you're done for. Marcus didn't react. He'd heard these things his entire life. Oak Ridge was no different. It was a wealthy institution where most students came from powerful families, where everything was determined by connections and unspoken favoritism. And to people like Jackson Wade, the world was very simple. There were those on top and those underneath. Jackson Wade, captain of the football team and son of a business magnate who regularly appeared at the mayor's fundraisers, was the type who had never known failure or rejection. Everything in his life came easily, from leading the football team to being favored by teachers to manipulating those weaker than himself. Jackson didn't need to be the best. He just needed people to see him as the best. He didn't need to be the strongest. He just needed others to believe he was the strongest. To him, dominance was a game, and anyone who didn't bow would pay the price. And Marcus, a new black student, quiet, friendless, without apparent support, was the perfect target. Jackson began with familiar tricks. He never struck immediately. He preferred to probe, to test his prey, to identify weaknesses before delivering the final blow. It started with shoulder bumps in the hallway, seemingly accidental but deliberately calculated. A slight push just enough to make Marcus step off balance, to cause the books in his hands to shift. Snickers from Jackson's friends followed as Marcus passed by, half joking and half serious, just loud enough for him to hear. Probably here on a scholarship. Maybe the school needed to fill some diversity quota. Hope he's not carrying a knife. These guys are known for violence. Through it all, Marcus's expression remained impassive. His eyes, deep and perceptive, betrayed nothing of what he felt inside, if he felt anything at all. The insults slid off him like rain on glass. These games weren't new. Marcus had seen people like Jackson 100 times. People who didn't need to win. They just wanted to see others surrender. But Marcus wasn't someone who surrendered. He didn't bow his head, didn't force a nervous laugh, didn't react. He just kept walking, silently, as if nothing had happened. It was precisely this indifference that irritated Jackson. He wasn't used to being ignored. Those he bullied always reacted in predictable ways. Either they trembled with fear, or they flared with anger. Both gave him satisfaction. But Marcus, he did nothing. He just kept walking as if Jackson didn't exist. And that drove him crazy. Jackson Wade had never allowed anyone to make him feel invisible, and he wasn't about to let it happen now. If Marcus thought he could ignore him forever, he was gravely mistaken. Marcus's indifference didn't discourage Jackson. It only made him more determined. He was accustomed to controlling others with his mere presence. He didn't need to hit or shout to make someone cower. Just a look, a smile with hidden meaning, a whispered word at the right moment, and he would get the desired reaction. But Marcus was different. Marcus neither responded nor submitted. He just continued walking, maintaining that infuriating calm. It wasn't weakness or fear. It was quiet confidence, as if he understood this game better than anyone else. And that alone angered Jackson more than anything else. The halls of Oak Ridge Academy, with their polished marble floors and mahogany accents, had always been Jackson's domain. Every morning, he'd enter through the east wing where the light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns that seemed to announce his arrival. The sound of his leather shoes against the floor had become a signal for younger students to press themselves against lockers, making way. Today was no different, except that Jackson's usual smug smile had been replaced by a tense expression. His jaw clenched tight enough to show the muscles working beneath his skin. Jackson decided to test Marcus's limits. The academy's hallways were always crowded in the morning, perfect for those accidental shoulder bumps. He didn't hesitate to let his shoulder slam hard into Marcus's as he passed. He waited for an angry glare, a retort, or any sign that he had struck a nerve. But Marcus just kept walking, as if Jackson didn't exist. Jackson gritted his teeth. His friends, always there to support and cheer his displays of power, began to sense the tension. "He's disrespecting you, bro. Maybe he thinks he's better than us. Maybe he doesn't know the rules around here." Jackson didn't need the reminder. He knew exactly what was happening, and he wasn't going to let it slide. One day, as Marcus was opening his locker, Jackson approached. This time, he wasn't planning to push or bump. He wanted to look directly into Marcus's eyes, search for a flicker of hesitation, any small reaction he could exploit. "Hey, kid," he said slowly, meaningfully. "Feel out of place here? This isn't your territory." His friends erupted in laughter. Other students glanced over before quickly looking away, not wanting to get involved. They all knew the rules at Oak Ridge: don't intervene, don't side with the weak, and especially don't confront Jackson Wade. Marcus closed his locker, unhurried, not angry. He turned to face Jackson, eyes meeting his for precisely 1 second. A blank stare, cold, but not fearful. It was the look of someone who had been through confrontations like this so many times they had become tedious. Jackson felt a slight shiver down his spine. The feeling passed quickly, but it was real. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply turned away and left, leaving Jackson standing there, his smile frozen in awkward uncertainty. Had he won? He had just humiliated Marcus in front of everyone, asserting his power at this school. But why? Why did he feel like he had lost something? This feeling was strange, and Jackson hated it. He clenched his fist. If Marcus thought he could ignore him forever, he had made a serious mistake. Marcus Stone could remain silent as long as he wanted, but sooner or later, Jackson would make him speak. Jackson hated feeling powerless. He had never been accustomed to being ignored, and he couldn't stand when someone dared to stand before him without showing even a hint of fear or weakness. Previously, when bullying others, he always received a response, a plea, a shameful bow of the head, or at least an uncontrolled burst of anger, giving him an excuse to push things further. But Marcus was different. He just stood there, calm, as if all of Jackson's provocations meant nothing. This couldn't continue. That afternoon, as soon as he entered the cafeteria, Jackson spotted Marcus sitting in a corner, alone as usual, eating lunch in silence. Marcus remained unchanged, showing no sign of discomfort or hesitation, no indication that he was feeling pressure from Jackson's actions. And that made Jackson furiously angry. He couldn't let this situation persist. If others thought Marcus could ignore him without consequences, he would lose the power he always had, the ability to control weaker people at will. It was no longer just about Marcus. It was about his reputation, how people at this school perceived him. The cafeteria of Oak Ridge Academy was a massive space that perfectly reflected the school's hierarchy. The central tables, bathed in natural light from the skylight, were unofficially reserved for the social elite, athletes, student council members, and children of the most influential families. The periphery, where shadows gathered in the corners, was where everyone else sat. Marcus had chosen the farthest corner, away from the center of activity, where the acoustics of the room muffled conversations into a distant hum. Jackson scanned the room, nodding to his friends, flashing a half smile. They all understood. The fun was about to begin. Jackson walked straight to Marcus's table, deliberately speaking louder than normal, enough to draw attention from surrounding tables. "Look at this, sitting alone again. Guess nobody wants to be your friend, huh?" His friends laughed uproariously. Some nearby students looked over but quickly turned away to avoid involvement. Everyone knew the rules. Don't intervene. Don't side with the weak. Don't confront Jackson Wade. Marcus didn't respond. He continued eating, his eyes steady, seemingly unconcerned with what was happening around him. Jackson gritted his teeth, waiting for a reaction. Any reaction. But there was none. This indifference was like a silent declaration of war, like an invisible slap more insulting than anything else. For a moment, he lost control. Without thinking, Jackson grabbed Marcus's lunch tray, gripping it tightly on both sides and violently jerking it upward. The crash echoed as the tray slammed against the table, food splattering all over Marcus. Thick sauce splashed onto his shirt, drink spilled down his sleeves, and bits of food scattered across the floor. The cafeteria fell silent. All conversations stopped, laughter died, and all eyes turned toward them. No one said a word. Some students exchanged glances. Others swallowed hard, while others looked down, pretending to focus on their food. Jackson stood there, leaning forward, waiting for a reaction. He wanted to see anger, confusion, loss of control, anything that proved he had won. But Marcus did nothing. He slowly put his fork down on the table, calmly looking at his food-stained clothes. He took a deep breath, very slowly, as if considering his next move. Then he looked up. No anger, no fear, no confusion, no trace of hurt. Just an empty, cold look, like silence itself. A chill ran down Jackson's spine. He couldn't explain why, but at that moment, he felt like he was the one standing on the edge of danger. It felt like he was no longer the hunter, but had accidentally stepped into a predator's territory. He couldn't comprehend it, but he quickly dismissed the strange feeling. No way. This was just a stubborn black kid. No way he could make him feel uneasy. Jackson straightened up, forcing an arrogant smile, but his voice betrayed tension. "Don't think you're special just because you look different, kid." His friends laughed again, while some other students looked down, pretending to focus on their food. But everyone knew what had just happened. Marcus didn't respond. He slowly stood up, unhurried, not bothering to brush the food off his shirt, showing none of the reactions Jackson had hoped for. He simply turned and left, not looking back, not showing any sign that he had just been humiliated in front of the entire school. This silence, it wasn't like surrender. It was more like a warning. Jackson remained standing, watching Marcus's retreating back, his smile gradually fading. He had won, hadn't he? He had just humiliated Marcus in front of everyone, asserting his power. But why? Why did he feel like he had lost something?
A shiver ran through Jackson.
This feeling was strange, and he didn't like it. But no matter how much he tried to reassure himself, there was one undeniable truth. He had unwittingly started a new game. The crystal chandelier overhead cast a soft golden light across the long wooden table where every dish was perfectly arranged. The steak cooked to perfection, the red wine gleaming in glasses, fresh vegetables neatly arranged on pristine white porcelain plates. Everything was prepared exactly as usual, precise down to the last detail, not a color out of place. But tonight, the atmosphere in the dining room was different. A heavy silence enveloped the space. No one spoke. No one broke the long silence between the two stone men. Marcus sat there, knife and fork placed neatly at the edge of his plate, his eyes not even glancing at the untouched steak. He had grown accustomed to formal dinners like this, with the unwritten rules his father had established long ago. No phones at the table, no messy eating, no pointless conversation. But tonight, he wasn't eating, not because of any rule, but because his mind was occupied with other thoughts. What happened at school that morning hadn't hurt or angered him, but he couldn't deny it had left a thought in his mind. Not about the bullying, but how he should handle it. Across the table, Victor Stone, his father, sat silently, enjoying his dinner. His black hair streaked with silver was smoothly combed back, his suit perfectly fitted without a wrinkle. At an age when many other men began withdrawing from power games, Victor still emanated an undeniable authority. In the underground world, he wasn't just anybody. He was a name that carried weight, a shadow that those in real power knew about but dared not mention directly. A man whose entrance into a room silenced even the toughest individuals. Marcus had lived his entire life under that shadow, not as an imposition, not as control, but as an invisible presence, always there, always reminding him that his family wasn't like other families. The Stone residence was a testament to Victor's particular tastes, elegant but not ostentatious, tucked away in the hills overlooking the city. It was a house that didn't need to announce itself. Those who needed to know of its existence already did. The dining room, with its dark mahogany panels and floor-to-ceiling windows that now reflected their images against the night outside, was where Victor preferred to conduct his most important conversations. When Victor spoke, it wasn't sudden or surprising, as if he had known something for a long time, just waiting for the right moment to speak. Something wrong? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked up at his father, his sharp brown eyes meeting Victor's cold, penetrating gaze. There was no comfort, no empty words of encouragement like most other parents would offer. With Victor, there was no soothing his son with warm words. He wanted only one thing, an answer. Marcus looked down, his finger tapping lightly on the edge of his plate, as if considering whether to speak. Then he sighed slightly and uttered the words he knew would lead to an unavoidable conversation. Just some guys who think they can bully others. A moment of silence passed. Victor didn't respond immediately. He continued cutting a piece of beef, chewing slowly as if Marcus hadn't spoken. But his eyes never left his son, watching him like a general assessing the battlefield before making a decision. When he put his knife and fork down, the soft clink of metal against the quiet space was like a bell signaling the conversation's shift. Names. His voice wasn't loud, not angry or threatening, but it carried a weight that made the room feel even more suffocating. Marcus had anticipated this question. He knew his father wouldn't accept a vague answer. Victor Stone wasn't someone who let things take their course. Everything in his life was controlled, calculated, handled the way he wanted. If someone dared to challenge his family, they would face consequences. But Marcus didn't want things to go in that direction. He shook his head, his gaze determined. I can handle it myself. Once again, silence enveloped the two men. Victor looked at his son for a long time, as if assessing whether his assertion was genuine confidence or just a mask for helplessness. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not a happy smile, not one of pride either. It was like an acknowledgement, a sign that he had seen something in his son's eyes, something he could respect. He picked up his wine glass, swirled the dark red liquid gently, and took a sip. Setting it down, he spoke slowly, his words heavy with implications. Good. Just one short word, but it contained so much. He didn't ask further, didn't force Marcus to reveal names. But right after that, he said something Marcus knew he would never forget. But remember, son, he tilted his head slightly, eyes observing Marcus as if weighing him. Sometimes enemies need to be reminded of their place. Marcus didn't answer right away. He understood his father perfectly. He could handle it himself, but Victor Stone wasn't talking about handling in the conventional way. He didn't believe in just enduring or waiting. In his world, power didn't lie in avoidance or overlooking, but in control. Marcus took a deep breath. He wasn't like his father, didn't want to become his father, but there was one thing he couldn't deny. He wouldn't let anyone else decide his fate. If Jackson Wade thought he could push him down without consequences, he was gravely mistaken. Marcus placed his knife and fork on the table, leaned back in his chair, his eyes growing colder. Perhaps it was time for Jackson Wade to understand who he truly was. Chapter 5. Whispers of Fear. The name, Marcus Stone, buzzed through the hallways, spreading like a breeze, but carrying the weight of an approaching storm. The whispers no longer stopped when Jackson appeared as they had before. Now they continued, sometimes just fragments of sentences, sometimes furtive, hesitant glances. But even though no one said it outright, he could still feel the change. Marcus's silence was no longer a sign of weakness, as he had once thought. Now it seemed like a warning. He tried to take a deep breath, stay calm, but anxiety still crept through his veins. He couldn't stand it. He needed to know for sure what he was getting into. He needed someone to confirm this was just a silly misunderstanding. A student passed by, a younger boy whose name Jackson couldn't remember. But right now, that didn't matter. He grabbed the boy's shoulder, his voice lower than usual, with a hint of urgency. "Stone. You mean Victor Stone?" The student turned pale, eyes widening, as if Jackson had just asked something that shouldn't be spoken aloud. He didn't answer immediately, just swallowed hard, as if deliberating whether to speak. That hesitation said everything. Jackson felt his heart beating faster, each beat resonating in his chest like a hammer striking cold steel. He released the student's shoulder, stepping back. No explanation was needed. He understood the answer. Victor Stone. A name his father had mentioned in a few important meetings, with a tone Jackson had never heard before. Once, he had overheard his father on the phone late at night. His voice was quieter, almost deferential. No longer the confident man who usually controlled every conversation. He mentioned that name, Victor Stone, then fell silent, as if merely mentioning it was enough to change the dynamics. Jackson remembered the feeling then, a strange sensation, because it was the first time he had seen his father hesitate. And now he understood why. His mind began connecting everything he had heard, everything he had done in the past week. He hadn't just bullied the wrong person. He had just messed with the son of a man feared throughout the underground world. The gleeful laughter, the taunts, the contemptuous looks, the food tray flipped in the cafeteria. Each image flashed by, each like a knife carving deeper the realization of the terrible mistake he had made. "No, it can't be," he muttered, but his voice no longer sounded certain. The more he tried to deny it, the more everything fell into place. Marcus Stone didn't react like others because he didn't need to. He didn't need to shout, hit back, or show anger because he knew all that was meaningless. Because he knew fear would find Jackson on its own. A chill ran down Jackson's spine. It was no longer annoyance or irritation at being ignored. Now it was genuine fear. Students around him still passed by, talking and laughing as usual. But to Jackson, it all seemed distant. The business card in his jacket pocket suddenly felt heavier. He remembered the small embossed text on the back of the card. "Play with fire. Get burned." It wasn't a direct threat. Not the kind of crude message that bullies send when they target the wrong tough guy. It was just a reminder. A simple truth, clear, requiring no explanation. Jackson swallowed hard, his fists gradually tightening. He felt the ground beneath his feet becoming fragile, as if he were walking on thin ice that could break at any moment. The student standing before him was still there, but no longer dared to look directly at him. He backed away, as if just standing near Jackson was dangerous enough. For the first time in his life, Jackson Wade felt small. He turned, walking away, not toward class, not heading anywhere in particular. He just knew he had to get away from here fast. But no matter how quickly he walked, no matter how much he tried to ignore the truth, there was one thing he couldn't change. The nightmare had begun, and this was just the beginning. Jackson couldn't remember how he had gone through the remaining classes. The words on the board, the teacher's lectures, the sound of pencils scratching on paper. Everything became meaningless, passing like a faded film. He couldn't focus, couldn't think coherently, because in his mind there was only one thought. He had disturbed the wrong person. The business card in his pocket remained there, like a cold reminder that this wasn't over. He could feel it through the fabric, as if it were gradually heating up, ready to ignite at any moment. The furtive glances in the hallway no longer contained the admiration or apprehension as before. No one patted him on the back. No one laughed when he passed by. The atmosphere around him had changed. He was no longer the hunter. He was becoming the prey. And that made him feel suffocated. The college preparatory hall of Oak Ridge, with its rows of leather-bound books and glass display cases showcasing Ivy League acceptance letters, had always been Jackson's favorite place to strut. Before today, he'd walk through like he owned it, shoulders back, chin high, knowing full well that one day his letter would be there too. Not because of merit, but because of his father's connections. Now this same hallway felt endless, the lights too bright, exposing him in ways he never wanted. The bell rang. Jackson stepped out of the school's main entrance with a heavy feeling in his chest. He didn't want to linger, instinct telling him to leave as quickly as possible. But as soon as he stepped into the courtyard, an uneasy premonition invaded. Something was wrong. Every day, the scene in front of the gates was familiar. Students pouring out in groups, cars lined up, parents waiting for their children, the usual bustling sounds. But today, among the crowd, two men stood out in a way Jackson couldn't ignore. They weren't students, nor parents. They stood a few steps away from the school gates, dressed neatly, not too flashy, but certainly not like ordinary people. Clean shirts, straight-ironed pants, polished shoes, everything neat and tidy, but nothing that could be called normal. These weren't men who had appeared by chance. They had come for him. Jackson suddenly understood, and his heart slowed. He had never met them before, but he knew this type of person, those who didn't need to say much, didn't need to do anything special. Just by standing there, they made everyone around them uneasy. They weren't bodyguards, nor police. They were Stone's men. When Jackson froze, one of the men looked directly at him, offering a slight smile. The smile wasn't friendly, it was merely social. "Mr. Stone would like to see you." The voice was deep, calm, without a trace of threat. It was simply an announcement, as if whether Jackson agreed or not didn't matter. Jackson felt cold sweat running down his spine. He could run, he could scream, cause a commotion in the schoolyard, do anything to make teachers or security notice. But he did nothing, because deep down, he knew it would all be futile. This wasn't an invitation. It was an order. Jackson swallowed, his throat dry. The feelings of confidence, power, untouchable privilege of the past were now just empty shells. He was no longer the one giving orders, he was receiving them. He couldn't remember how he had followed those two men. Everything happened in a fog. Students still laughing and talking, cars still coming and going, teachers still walking out of the building. But to Jackson, it all became alien. He was entering a world he didn't understand, a place he shouldn't have set foot in. They led him to the parking lot behind the school, where usually only teachers and staff parked their cars. There were fewer people passing by, perfect for private meetings. And there, beside a sleek black car, someone was waiting. No introduction was needed. No name was mentioned. Jackson knew exactly who it was. Marcus Stone leaned against the car, hands in his pockets, his eyes calm, as if this were just a normal appointment. No sign of anger, no hint of hatred or desire for revenge. But that was precisely what made it more frightening. Because someone about to take revenge often loses control, while someone in complete control needs to do nothing. Jackson stopped, not daring to take another step. His fingers unconsciously clenched, but there was no strength left. He was no longer the center of this story. Marcus looked up, his sharp eyes directed straight at Jackson, and at that moment, Jackson realized something chilling. Marcus had never been the prey. He had only been waiting for the right moment to show that he was the real predator. Jackson Wade had been through many difficult situations. Fights after football games, arguments with teachers when caught cheating, even pranks he himself had orchestrated to test boundaries. But never had he felt cornered like he did now. He stood there, back stiff, eyes wide, looking at Marcus but unable to speak. The two men behind him remained motionless. No one signaling, no one applying specific pressure, but their presence was like two invisible walls, blocking any escape or resistance. Opposite him, Marcus remained calm, his deep eyes seemingly seeing through Jackson's thoughts. Not angry, not hateful, not a person nurturing revenge. There was only one thing: absolute control. The parking lot behind Oak Ridge Academy was mostly empty at this hour. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt, creating a stark contrast between light and dark. A few cars remained, belonging to teachers staying late to grade papers or coach after-school activities. From here, the sounds of the football team practicing on the distant field were barely audible, a reminder of the normal life continuing just beyond this surreal bubble of tension. "You thought I was weak?" Marcus asked softly, his voice deep, deliberate, each word echoing in Jackson's head. Jackson didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't dare. Any response at this point would be a mistake. He couldn't say yes because that would be the stupidest thing. He also couldn't say no, because that would be like admitting his own weakness. Marcus looked at him for a long time, seemingly pondering, then stepped forward one pace, not fast, not slow, but enough to make the space between them feel suffocating. Jackson didn't back away, but he felt his entire body tensing. Then, Marcus leaned in close enough for Jackson to feel his breath against his ear, whispering, "I don't need to touch you, but if I wanted to, your life would change forever." Sweat soaked the back of Jackson's shirt. This wasn't an ordinary threat, not a boastful line from those who act tough, not like the warnings he had heard from teachers or coaches. It was the truth. Because when Marcus uttered those words, Jackson believed every single one. He felt the cold certainty, the immovable confidence in Marcus's voice. No need for proof, no need for explanation, because this wasn't an empty threat. It was a reality Jackson had to face. If Marcus wanted, he could act right now. No hitting, no shouting, no commotion. Just one call, one message to the right person, and Jackson Wade would never be the same again. Not just expelled from school or kicked off the team, but something deeper, permanent, irreparable. Jackson heard his heart pounding in his chest, but he couldn't control it. Marcus slowly backed away, his expression unchanged. He didn't need to emphasize further, because the message was crystal clear. Jackson had lost. He could do nothing but stand there, accepting the truth. That feeling, like being stripped bare, every illusion of strength, fame, and control he thought he had, now vanished in just a few minutes. All he had ever done, ever believed, now meant nothing when standing before this person. Marcus didn't need to hit him, didn't need to push, didn't need to humiliate him. He only needed Jackson to understand that he no longer controlled his own fate. Jackson wasn't sure how long he had stood there, but when Marcus turned to leave, relief didn't come. Because he knew this wasn't over. It had just begun. Jackson still stood motionless, his legs seemingly glued to the cold concrete of the parking lot, his hands unconsciously clenched but without any strength. His shirt was soaked with sweat despite the afternoon not being hot. Marcus had turned away, but the pressure still weighed heavily in his chest. His presence seemed to linger, as if Jackson were still bound by an invisible cord, unable to escape. The two strange men remained in place, not smiling, not speaking, not threatening. But their silence was what frightened him most. They didn't need to touch him, because everything had been predetermined. The world Jackson had believed in, where he had power, fame, and thought he controlled everything, was crumbling piece by piece. Marcus hadn't just proven that Jackson couldn't control him. He had shown him that he had never controlled anything at all. He didn't remember how he had left the parking lot. His feet moved aimlessly, his breathing heavy, his mind empty. He just wanted to get away from there, just wanted to go home, just wanted to find somewhere safer. But was there truly any safe place? At the student parking area, where his black Mustang was parked, he habitually took out his phone. He wasn't sure what he was about to do: call someone, text his father, or try to understand what had just happened. But as soon as he turned on the screen, a new message from an unknown number appeared. He read it quickly, and the words cut into his mind, making his heart nearly stop. "Tell your father to be careful with his business. Accidents can happen." Jackson felt his heart drop to the pit of his stomach. No, this couldn't be real. He read it again, hoping he was mistaken, hoping this was just a cruel joke from someone. But the words remained unchanged. It was brief, not loud, not aggressive, but carried a weight he had never felt before. He stared at the screen, his fingers numb, unable to type anything. For a moment he told himself, maybe it's just a prank. But then he realized Marcus didn't need to joke. Marcus didn't need to send meaningless threats. Because if he wanted, this message wouldn't be a warning, but a reality about to happen. Jackson felt ice cold. He had never thought that childish bullying at school would lead to this level. He had always thought he was the one in control, able to humiliate anyone without paying a price, that no one could touch him. But now, he realized he hadn't just chosen the wrong target, but had stepped into an alien world. Marcus didn't need to use his hands. No need to hit. No need to humiliate him in front of the whole school. He only needed to show Jackson a small corner of his capabilities, and that was enough for Jackson to be swallowed by fear. His hand trembled as he tried to put the phone back in his pocket. He wanted to forget that message, pretend it never existed. But no matter how hard he tried, those words still echoed in his head, carved deep like a knife. "Tell your father to be careful. Accidents can happen." He had never thought about his father being in danger. Jackson wasn't easily intimidated. He had grown up in a family where power was used as a weapon. His father was a big businessman, had relationships with many powerful people, sat at the same table with the mayor and those who could decide the destiny of an entire neighborhood with just one phone call. But no matter how strong his father was, he still wasn't Victor Stone. And now, Jackson wasn't sure if his father's connections were enough to protect him. What should he do? Pretend nothing was happening? Pretend he was still in control, that everything would be okay? Or should he tell his father? But if he did, he would have to confess everything, that he had made a terrible mistake, that he had dragged the family into danger, that he had lost. Jackson stood by his car door, breathing heavily, his heart pounding so violently he felt choked. His fingers trembled as he pressed the unlock button, but he didn't get in immediately. He just stood there, his mind blank. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless. No way out, no one to call for help, no way to regain control. Because this time, he wasn't the one making the rules. He was merely a pawn, checkmated. Jackson Wade was no longer himself. He had once been the center of attention, a ruler of hallways, the leader of his friends, someone who never bowed to anyone. But now, he was just a shadow. No one knew exactly what had changed. He still came to school every day, still wore his football team jacket, still walked the familiar corridors. But now, he didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't look for people to bully. The friends who used to follow him, those who cheered when he pushed others against walls, who laughed gleefully when he humiliated someone in front of a crowd, now stayed away. No one said anything, but everyone saw it. Jackson Wade had changed. The once vibrant atmosphere that surrounded him had dulled. The loud, boisterous laughter that used to erupt from his group as they dominated the lunch tables at the center of the cafeteria had been replaced by an uncomfortable silence. His closest friends exchanged confused glances when they thought he wasn't looking, whispering theories behind his back. Some said he was dealing with family problems. Others claimed he had received bad news about college applications. No one dared ask directly, and Marcus Stone didn't need to do anything. For the first time, Jackson understood that true fear didn't come from fists or threats, but from silence. Marcus's silence was what haunted him most. There was no public revenge, no loud confrontation, no rumors about a payback plan. Just absolute silence. And that silence was driving him crazy. Jackson had hoped that if Marcus wanted revenge, he would act immediately. A punch, a fight, a clear threat, anything visible. But Marcus didn't need to do that, because fear had found Jackson on its own, without anyone's intervention. For the first time, Jackson knew the feeling of losing control. He began avoiding Marcus. If he saw him in the hallway, he turned another direction. If Marcus entered the cafeteria, Jackson would grab his food quickly and leave. If Marcus walked into class, Jackson kept silent throughout. None of the sarcastic, taunting comments he used to make. No one said it out loud. No one pointed directly that Jackson was afraid of Marcus, but everyone could see it in his every gesture. The Oak Ridge halls, which had once seemed like his personal kingdom, now felt like a maze of potential encounters with the one person he desperately wanted to avoid. Jackson found himself mapping alternative routes between classes, timing his movements to minimize any chance of crossing paths with Marcus. The once confident stride that had parted crowds was replaced by a hurried, furtive walk, his eyes constantly scanning ahead for any sign of the Stone Boy. In the first days, he tried to convince himself that it was all just a temporary feeling. But as time passed, the fear grew. The nightmare had crept into his life in ways he couldn't control. He often dreamed of standing in a dark room, no one around, just whispers echoing through the darkness. Not threatening, not shouting, just a deep, powerful voice pouring into his ear like a snake coiling around his neck. "You thought I was weak?" Jackson would jolt awake in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat. Each time his phone vibrated, his heart raced, fearing another message. But there was nothing. Marcus didn't text, didn't seek him out, didn't look at him for longer than a second. Marcus didn't need to do anything. The fear was now inside Jackson. He no longer needed anyone to threaten him, because his own mind was punishing him. His former close friends disappeared. They saw him change and gradually distance themselves. No one wanted to be around someone who had lost their power. Those who used to follow him, laugh with him, cheer him on, now whispered behind his back, as if afraid of catching his weakness like a disease. No one considered him the strongest anymore, because the strongest would never know fear. And Jackson now lived in fear. 1 week after the incident in the parking lot, Jackson realized he was just a shadow of his former self. He no longer cared about showing off in front of others, didn't care about reputation or proving anything, because he just wanted to survive, not angering anyone, not bothering anyone, not drawing attention, just wanting to be safe. But he knew a truth even more frightening. He would never feel safe again, because now he understood what happened when you disturb the wrong person. Marcus Stone didn't need to hit him, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to do anything. He just let Jackson destroy himself, and that was the most terrible punishment. Marcus didn't need to lift a finger. He didn't need to punch Jackson, didn't need to threaten, didn't need to make a scene or engage in meaningless fights. He just needed to let him understand that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. Fear didn't come from external wounds, but from things that couldn't be seen. The physical toll of this constant anxiety began to show. Jackson's face, once perpetually arranged in an arrogant smirk, now appeared gaunt, with dark circles forming under his eyes from sleepless nights. His academic performance, never stellar but always passable, thanks to teacher favoritism, began to slip dramatically. Even on the football field, where he had once commanded respect through sheer force of personality rather than exceptional talent, his performance faltered. The coach had pulled him aside twice already, asking if everything was all right at home. Home. The word itself had taken on a different meaning. The luxurious estate where Jackson had always felt untouchable now seemed vulnerable, exposed. Each night as he pulled into the circular driveway, he found himself scanning the perimeter, looking for unfamiliar cars or watching shadows with newfound paranoia. The message about his father's safety had carved a wound deeper than any physical threat could have. For the first time in his life, Jackson worried about someone other than himself. Jackson Wade was no longer the ruler of Oak Ridge. He was just a walking shell, an animal that once dominated the entire forest, now become prey to its own fear. And Marcus, he never needed violence to win. In the days that passed, Marcus's silence became a presence that loomed over Jackson's life. No one mentioned it directly, but the entire school sensed the change. Before, Jackson Wade had been someone people were wary of. When he entered a room, he dominated the space, forcing everyone to notice. A pat on the shoulder, a sharp taunt, a smirk when he saw someone bow their head. Now, everything was reversed. Now, when Marcus entered a room, no one dared look at him too long. Not with the same kind of fear of violence that Jackson had once instilled, but a more discreet, subtle fear. Fear of a person who didn't need to prove his strength, because everyone knew he had it. Marcus rarely spoke, and showed no pleasure in Jackson's downfall. He simply continued living his life, quietly, confidently, unchanged. But that very calmness made people more wary. Marcus didn't need to pretend to be anything to protect himself, because he no longer needed to. Jackson Wade understood this better than anyone. He didn't dare look directly into Marcus's eyes, didn't dare enter the same room without feeling suffocated. Each time he passed Marcus in the hallway, he felt like something was choking him, a quiet panic, a feeling of being watched, even though no one was looking. Perhaps it was just an illusion, or maybe it was the truth. Because once you fell under Marcus Stone's control, no one escaped. The matter could have ended, if not for what happened one Friday afternoon. Jackson left school later than usual. He no longer lingered on the football field or hung out with friends. He just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. But when he reached the parking lot, the sight before him almost made him stop breathing. Marcus was standing there, right beside his car. He wasn't doing anything, not touching the car, not standing in a threatening way. He was just waiting. Jackson froze, not knowing what to do. Run? Where would he go? Confront? He knew he had no chance. He could only stand there, waiting for the next nightmare. Marcus looked at him for a long time, then slowly approached. To Jackson, each second felt like a century, and when only a few steps remained between them, Marcus stopped. He didn't smile, wasn't angry either. He just looked straight into Jackson's eyes, a look that made Jackson feel smaller than ever. Then he said one sentence, just one single sentence, that Jackson would never forget. Do you understand now? No threat, no warning, no violence. Just a simple question, but it contained everything that had happened. Jackson couldn't part his lips. He didn't need to answer. Marcus knew he understood, truly understood, and that was the most frightening thing. Jackson Wade stood frozen. Marcus wasn't intimidating him. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to be aggressive. He just looked at him with eyes that contained no hatred, malice, or anger, just absolute calmness. But that very calmness was the most terrifying. Jackson understood, and Marcus knew he understood. That moment lasted only seconds, but to Jackson, it was like a permanent etching into his life. Marcus needed to do nothing more. He had won. Jackson never returned to his old self. In the days that followed, he still came to school, but he was no longer himself. He no longer walked arrogantly down the hallways, controlling his friends like puppets. Nor did he make anyone fear or admire him. He was just a shadow of himself. Some students whispered about the sudden change. Some said he was obsessing over something. Others guessed he was going through a crisis, but no one knew for sure. And more importantly, no one dared ask. Because there was one thing everyone understood clearly. Marcus Stone had done nothing. No violence, no direct threats,
no public actions. But the result was undeniable. Jackson Wade had been defeated without a single punch. Marcus continued his life as before, not needing to change anything. He didn't boast about what had happened, didn't show arrogance or demonstrate power, because he didn't need to do so. Those who needed to understand had understood.
Anyone who wanted to challenge had backed down. The rumors about him grew stronger each day, but no one dared confront him directly. Marcus Stone didn't need to be aggressive to make others afraid, because now his silence was his strongest weapon. True power didn't lie in fists, wasn't in shouting to impose oneself, wasn't in boasting or demanding respect. True power was when others understood on their own that they shouldn't challenge you. No need to hit, no need to prove. Just be present, and they would step back. Jackson Wade would never forget. He would never dare touch Marcus again. Not because he feared being hit, but because he knew he couldn't match what he couldn't control. And that absolute control always belonged to Marcus. He had once thought he understood what power was, but now realized that real power doesn't come from threats. It comes from absolute control. As the school year progressed, Jackson gradually faded from the spotlight that had once defined him. His position as team captain was quietly passed to the co-captain in what the coach called a restructuring to better distribute leadership. His seat at the center lunch table remained empty for days until someone else eventually claimed it. The group of friends who had once hung on his every word found new leaders to follow, new dynamics forming in the vacuum he left behind. What surprised everyone most wasn't that Jackson had fallen. Social hierarchies at Oak Ridge had always been fluid, but that no one rose to take his exact place. There was a subtle shift in the school's atmosphere. The type of bullying and overt dominance that had been Jackson's trademark seemed to lose its appeal, as if everyone had glimpsed the consequences of overreaching. And through it all, Marcus never claimed the throne Jackson had vacated. He remained as he had always been, quiet, self-contained, neither seeking nor avoiding attention. His power lay not in domination, but in the respect his very presence commanded. Students began to nod to him in hallways, make space when he passed, not out of fear, but out of a new kind of deference that came from recognizing true strength. This was perhaps the most profound change of all, the realization spreading through Oak Ridge that real power didn't announce itself with noise and aggression. Real power was quiet, controlled, inevitable. The way people moved around Marcus in the hallways, the way conversations shifted when he entered a room. These weren't reactions born from terror like they had been with Jackson, but from something deeper, respect. And somewhere in the shadows of his new existence, even Jackson Wade had come to understand the difference. True strength wasn't in making others feel small, but in being so secure in your own power that you never needed to prove it at all. Marcus had taught them all a lesson they would never forget. Without raising his voice, without throwing a single punch. That was true power, the shadow that falls without a sound. Epilogue. 2 years later. The sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Oak Ridge Academy as students filed out after graduation. Caps had been thrown, diplomas received, and the air was filled with the bittersweet mixture of accomplishment and farewell. Parents snapped photos, younger siblings ran between groups of graduates, and teachers offered final congratulations to their departing students. Marcus Stone stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, diploma in hand, watching the scene with his characteristic calm. He had completed his time at Oak Ridge without incident after that fateful confrontation 2 years earlier. He hadn't sought attention or power, had never abused the respect he'd earned, and had focused simply on his studies and a small circle of genuine friends who had gradually formed around him. Across the lawn, Jackson Wade stood with his parents, forcing a smile for photographs. The past 2 years had changed him in ways no one could have predicted. The arrogant bully had vanished, replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful. His fall from social dominance had been painful, but in that pain, he had found something unexpected: freedom from the exhausting performance of constant superiority. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. No words were exchanged, but there was a moment of recognition.
an acknowledgement of the lesson that had reshaped not just Jackson, but the entire social ecosystem of Oak Ridge. Jackson gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Marcus returned it with the slightest inclination of his head.
"Ready to go, son?" Victor Stone appeared at Marcus's side, immaculate as always in a tailored suit that spoke of power without needing to announce it. "Just a minute, Dad," Marcus replied, watching as Jackson turned away to join his family. "That the Wade boy?" Victor asked, following his son's gaze. "Yes." Victor studied his son's expression. "You've carried yourself well here, better than I might have in your position." Marcus smiled slightly. "I learned from watching you. Real power doesn't need to be exercised to be effective." Victor placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a rare gesture of affection and approval. "You've surpassed the lesson. I would have broken him completely." "What would be the point?" Marcus asked. "He's no threat, and he's learned something valuable." As they walked toward the car, Marcus glanced back at the school that had taught him far less than the experiences within its walls had. Oak Ridge would continue its cycles of social hierarchies and teenage power struggles, but he liked to think he had left it slightly better than he found it. A place where perhaps power might be understood differently by at least a few. In the distance, Jackson Wade watched the Stone family depart. The fear had gradually subsided over time, replaced by a complex mixture of respect and a strange sense of gratitude. The lesson had been painful but invaluable. True strength wasn't found in domination, but in character. He would carry the shadow of that understanding with him forever, not as a burden, but as the foundation of whoever he might yet become.